This is Jerome Rand, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Jerome has done something incredible, and it's inspirational, and all of us want to do it, but Jerome actually did. And I've got in co-hosting for the second time on the Break It Down Show, Scott Shipman, and he's the one that turned me on to Jerome's story. So I'm going to let Scott tell us why we're talking to Jerome. Scott, welcome back.
Thanks, Pete. Nice to meet you, Jerome. I feel like I know you. I've read your book twice.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's an honor. If you read it once, that's one thing, but a second time, that really means something.
Well, thank you. It's sort of an inspiration. Jerome is noteworthy, as Pete said, because Jerome, without a sponsor, sailed a 32-foot 70s era sailboat, a West Sail 32, nonstop around the world, and not just around the world, but by the 5 Capes. That's down the roaring 40s. That's where the weather is predictably bad just about all the time. And it's a great read. And if you haven't read the book, it's called Sailing to Oblivion. And I would highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in sailing, but really anyone who's interested in an example of the human spirit and just what we can do if we put our minds to it without big time sponsors. That alone is noteworthy.
Well, thank you, Scott. I definitely appreciate that. I mean, it was one of those things that I really did want to make sure that I was doing this whole trip sort of on my own back. And I wanted to do that sort of to my own detriment, just to be able to sort of inspire people and let them know that you don't need all the big time sponsors and the big time money. All you really need is a good game plan and the drive to sort of go ahead and go for it.
Did you have a good game plan? I mean, turns out, did that actually come to pass?
Yeah, I mean, it worked out as far as my sort of 5-year plan. So the whole idea, or not the idea, but basically the kick in the butt that I needed to go for it was when I finished the Appalachian Trail. And that was when I sort of said, okay, this just feels too good, going for these big challenges and trying to see them through. And that was the point where, yeah, I mean, my plan was, I figured 5 years. I figured 3 years of working to save up the money, and then a year to get the boat, fix it up, and then the year to do the trip. And it actually all worked out pretty well. I mean, you know, obviously there were a lot of problems on the actual adventure, but that's part of it. So my 5-year plan actually worked out pretty good. And I ended up with a boat at the end of it, if nothing else.
A nice boat.
Yeah, I mean, she's a little worse for wear right now. I went on another sort of fiasco of a journey in 2020, which ended up getting shut down because I couldn't go up through the Northwest Passage. They had closed it down after I left. So I spent the entirety of this hurricane season circling the Atlantic, waiting until I could get back to the East Coast. And so I'm still doing repairs and varnishing and stuff like that on the boat to this day.
Wow.
When you decide to take something like this on, I mean, with no sponsors and all of that, it still seems impossible. Like, there are just so many things to account for. Were you already a seasoned and prepared sailor, or did you have to add to your sailing box of tools?
In some ways, I sort of, I probably had maybe 30 or 40,000 miles under my belt. But that was all done on boats where I was either a crew member or a first mate or even a captain. And so in that respect, yeah, I mean, I knew sort of what the ocean world was all about. I had crossed the Atlantic a few times. So in that respect, for sure. But I had never solo sailed before in my life. So when I got down to the Caribbean on Mighty Sparrow and was doing all my training, that I'll never forget my first solo trip. It was from the British Virgin Islands down to an island called Dominica, which is about halfway down the island chain. And I was absolutely terrified. I didn't know how I was going to sleep, do anything. It was only like a 3-day trip, but it felt like an eternity to me. And when I got there, I pretty much collapsed. I was so exhausted, but slowly but surely I was able to sort of learn the things that I needed to learn and figure out how the whole world of solo sailing works. And, really in a nutshell, it's learning to trust the boat and the equipment on the boat, because without that, you can't just put your head down and actually get some sleep each day, which is probably the thing that I think worries most people when they think about going out by themselves is that, how are you actually going to go and sleep? That's probably the biggest question I always get.
And the weather, particularly in the Indian Ocean, didn't allow you a whole lot of sleep.
Yeah, and the Indian Ocean has a really notorious reputation for being, just up and down, really violent, lots of big calms, and I found all of that. I mean, and when you sail around the world like I did, so you have to go south of the Cape of Good Hope, so the southern tip of South Africa, and that's called the Cape of Storms, and it's aptly named because basically these giant gales roll off of Antarctica about once a week, and they sweep away on the ocean. And there's a big current called the Agulhas Current that runs down the coast. And when these southerly gales smash into that current, they produce the kind of waves that take down tankers and take down cruise ships, things like that. So you can imagine a little 32-foot boat with one little guy sailing on it, doesn't really have a fighting chance if things want to get really, really bad. So that's just the first speed bump to get into the Indian Ocean. And then I think for me, it was another 50 or 55 days before I got south of Australia. So it's pretty tough. And that's also not to mention that their cyclone season sort of comes into play in January. And that was where I had my second encounter with a named storm, was right smack in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And that was Cyclone Irving. And it just clipped me. I was able to sort of do what you're not supposed to do, which is to cut in front of it. But it did knock me down in the middle of the night, gave me a pretty good scare, one that I'll never forget. And definitely taught me a few lessons about what you should do and what you shouldn't do out there on the ocean.
Wow. I believe you had 2 knockdowns on this trip?
Yeah, 2 like full-on mast hitting the water sort of knockdowns, and they were both caused by large waves. And the first one was in Cyclone Irving in the Indian Ocean, and then the second one, which was much more violent, was sometime in March in the South Pacific Ocean, and that was deep in the Southern Ocean, heading towards Cape Horn, and just in a massive, really extended gale, and the waves just basically started getting out of control. And I was doing really well for a good amount of time. And then I think as the wind started to drop off, my boat speed started to drop as well. And that sort of allowed these big breaking waves to start smashing over the stern of the boat. And I was a little more vulnerable than I wanted to be, but I couldn't put any more sail up. I was just having too much trouble in the high winds. And so I had actually gone down below to sort of wait it out a little bit. And then in the middle of the night, and you can hear these rumbling waves sort of passing by the hull, and you can hear them off in the distance. But then every once in a while, the rumble just gets louder and louder. And then I can only equate it to the impact of like a car crash. It just feels like something solid has just smashed in. And then the boat just instantly is cascaded down this wave. And that one tossed a lot of stuff over. It ripped a bunch of stuff off the deck. I found a lot of cracks in a lot of the areas on the boat. After months and months of looking around and cleaning stuff, I started finding more areas where that one blow had really sort of twisted the whole boat in a way. And that one was really scary because it was in the middle of the night. And unlike the first time, I was just still in this massive storm, and I had to get up there and I had to put more sail up while all this was going on. And it was interesting. It was a night I will never forget. That's for sure.
Wow. It's incredible. So your book, I forget how I found your book. But I read it last year and gave it to a sailing instructor friend of mine. And I'm in the process of looking at a West Sail right now up in Virginia. And so the fellow that owns the boat sent me a copy for Christmas. And we live in Beaufort, South Carolina. And there's a fellow over here on a Baba 40 with his wife, and they're getting ready to go to St. Augustine. And I just took it over and said, would you be interested in reading this? And this guy cruises full time. And he read it in one sitting. He loved the book. I went over and had a cup of coffee with him. And he said, Jerome is crazy. I said, what do you mean? He said, he climbed the mast without a bosun's chair. Can you tell us a little about that? That is kind of nutty, Jerome.
Well, but on my mast on Mighty Sparrow, there's stairs that go up it, and I will say, you know, a little caveat here, it's very dangerous to do that. You always want to use any safety harnesses and things like that you can. But for me, being out there alone, it's just one of those things where I want to be able to get up the mast and back down it as fast as possible.
Right.
And the less things that I have to hook on and that will impede me getting up and down quickly, that's what I typically worry about. So, you know, I practice. I go up and down the mast all the time, not at sea, but when I'm, you know, tied up to a dock and such. And I don't know. I think you hold on about 10 times tighter when you don't have any safety line on. That's for sure. It's kind of like the Alex Honnold, who did the free solo of El Cap.
Oh yeah,
he could tell you better than I could. But there's a certain amount of focus that comes into your mind when you are in that situation where you know that if you slip or there's a misstep, you're gonna die. Yeah. And you know, most people would disagree with me on that, but it's worked for me so far, knock on wood.
Well, I hope it continues to work for you. Tell us about your provisioning. Water was a big issue, right?
Yeah, water was pretty bad. Because one of the problems when you do these things unsponsored is that obviously your budget is a lot less than you would like it to be. And some of the niceties that normally you might be able to get through a company or a sponsorship, you obviously have to pay for, and I couldn't do that. And so one of the nice things these days is to have, you know, a mechanical or an electric water maker so that you can just produce water on the fly. As long as you have the electricity, you can go for it. And didn't have the funds for that. So I've always tried to catch rain while I was out there on other trips, and I was pretty successful with that. And I also did have an emergency desalinization pump, like a little hand pump, and that it only produces, you know, about a gallon an hour. It's about the most annoying thing in the world to have to do, and it's even more scary when you actually have to rely on it. But long story short, as I got into the Indian Ocean after maybe 80 or 90 days at sea, I was so low on water because it just didn't rain in the South Atlantic. And then anytime it rained in the Southern Ocean, it was also so windy that I couldn't actually collect any clean, fresh water. So I started having to use the pump when I got down below about 20 gallons. And that pump only lasted maybe a week before it exploded and I couldn't fix it. And then suddenly my adventure really began. That's how I usually like to describe it. It's when things start going wrong that all of a sudden it's like, okay, now the challenge is 10 times because I have to basically be able to catch every bit of rain that I can just to be able to survive, let alone having to sort of ration my water from that point on. And you know, luckily down there it's pretty cold, so I wasn't sweating too much, but only drinking, you know, 32 or 50 ounces of water a day, it's not good. It's not good at all. It hurts everything, you know, everything from your digestion to what you can eat, because I had a lot of dehydrated stuff on board that needed water just to make it, and I couldn't really eat that at that point either. So, but I think the biggest effect is that it's mentally, it's very scary to watch your water resources dwindle when you're in the middle of an ocean. I think at that point I had maybe another 2,000 miles to get to Australia if I needed to pull in and actually fill up on water, which I definitely didn't want to do, but if I had to, I for sure would have. And you know, you'll be out there sometimes and rain squalls will be passing you by maybe a mile away. And, you know, you can wish all you want, but it's not going to make it rain. And then sometimes it rains and rains, but it's so windy again, it mixes up with salt water and the waves and the splashing. So it got scary. I mean, at my lowest point, I believe it was 2 gallons of fresh water on board. And to be, in that position, I wouldn't want to wish that on anybody. It's absolutely terrifying.
When you're talking about getting water and mixing with the wind on your YouTube channel, you have a little vlog post about that, and you show how you collect water off the sail. But you have to let the salt wash off the sail, and I don't know how long that takes. But then once you do that, you would go up with like a jug and like a funnel type thing, and then you would fill these gallons. So 2 questions. One, how many gallons of backup like that do you store? And then how much wind is too much wind? It seems like there's always going to be a 10-mile-an-hour wind if you're sailing and it's raining, but I don't know. I'm asking.
Right. Well, it sort of just depends as far as the wind goes. If all of a sudden it's blowing like crazy, what I'll typically do if my whole goal is just to catch rain, then I'll turn directly with the wind. And I'll try and make it so that any waves that are splashing aren't making it into the sail. But it really depends on the sea state mixing with the wind. Sometimes you just can't avoid it. I've had one time where I had a 5-gallon jug that was almost completely filled with perfect fresh water, and then one random wave rolled us so that the end of the boom went directly into the sea. As it came back up, it shoved about 1 gallon of salt water right into the jug. Lord. So the whole thing was useless, and I ended up having to pour it right out. So it's sort of one of those things where you just have to have sort of the perfect conditions. Now, it typically only takes maybe 3 or 4 minutes for all the salt water to rinse off the sail, if it's really raining pretty hard. But, it all depends on the situation. And sometimes when you think it's guaranteed you're going to catch some, it ends up something spoils it. And then other times you'll think, oh, this isn't going to actually last. And then you get a full day of a light rain and are able to catch, 20 gallons of water.
Wow.
I would always keep, as far as those jugs on my long distance trips, I always have 5-gallon water jugs. And typically 1 or 2 of those will be always set aside for emergencies. And then the other ones, I'll just use those. I'll fill them up. And then if the water is really good, then I'll go and put those into my main tanks. But I typically will have about 6 different containers that I can put the water in. And in some parts of the world, you can catch rainwater, but if you don't drink it in 24 hours, the bacteria that grows, you can't drink it after that, no matter what you do to it. I've even put bleach in, and all that does is make it taste horrible. And then also these black little balls start forming in the water. It's typically off the African coast when sort of the wind and clouds mix with the Sahara dust. But yeah, sometimes you can't actually drink the water that falls out of the sky out there.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a shot. That's a surprise. I wanted to ask another logistics question then. So if you're getting low on water, what is low where you're like, I need to turn towards land? I mean, sailing towards Australia is one thing, but there's a whole shitload of islands between wherever and Australia, right? So do you
No.
Well, yes, you're right. There's not, but it seems like with all of those islands that you could get to truck or somewhere in Micronesia, but you were south of all that, right?
Yeah, well, and the Indian Ocean is absolutely empty, the South Indian Ocean. So there's 2 small islands right in the middle called Amsterdam Island and St. Paul. And I was communicating with a friend of mine who was trying to see if it would be a possibility for me to at least pull up to the island and have water brought out if it was an emergency. But because it's a French scientific group that stays on there, maybe 4 or 5 people. And he had made a few leaps into that, but eventually was basically told that it wouldn't happen. And yeah, I mean, in the Indian Ocean, you're pretty much on your own, and you sort of just have to deal with that. Other places, though, I don't like to ever have less than 20 gallons of fresh water, because if you sink it down to, if you ration to, a quart or 2 quarts a day, then you've got a couple of weeks, maybe, I guess, what is that? You got over a month to be able to get somewhere. You'd have to check my math on that one, but because it's 4 quarts to a gallon, I think. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, if you're drinking 2 quarts a day, you got 20 gallons. So that gives you 40 days to get somewhere. And 40 days, you can make it almost across in any ocean, really, at that point. So that's sort of my cutoff. But if I had my choice, I'd have over 50 gallons at all times on the boat, because then you've got plenty. You can take showers, you can do whatever. And you do also want to consider that it doesn't take much to have one of those water tanks, rupture or something to go wrong. The first guy who sailed around the world, Sir Robin Knox Johnson, he ended up sort of in the same situation in the Indian Ocean. His water tanks got polluted, and he had to catch rain for the rest of his trip as well. And, it's just one of those things where you have to sort of plan for the worst and hope for the best.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple of times that you had communications with family and friends. How exactly did you communicate, Jerome?
Yeah, so I had what's called a Garmin InReach, and it's just a small handheld thing that it's a GPS unit that links in with a smartphone, and it allows you to text people anywhere on the planet.
Wow.
And it's the one device, because they have that, and they also have another thing called a spot tracker. But the spot tracker doesn't work throughout most of the South Pacific or most of the Southern Ocean. So I would have been off the board at that point. And the Garmin InReach, it worked the whole way around, and it was basically something where to set people's minds at ease. Originally, I didn't even want to have that, but I sort of understood that, for my family's sake, I really needed to be able to do that daily check-in. And it turned into something really great for, well over 1,000 people, because they were able to watch the updates every morning and sort of share in the experience.
So that's essentially real-time communications, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would text, and then I could receive a text right back. And, there were definitely a few times in some pretty scary storms where, I'm texting my brother saying, hey, what's going on? Because I can download the weather when the weather is okay. If the boat's getting tossed around and everything's crazy, I won't pull the computer out to do the downloads. And so I would text him, and then he would kind of give me a heads up and let me know what I was in for and how bad it was actually going to get, that sort of stuff.
In your video tour of Mighty Sparrow, you mentioned that you have a case that you keep all of your electronics in.
Yeah, big Pelican case, kind of like a suitcase size.
Okay.
And that held all the computers and the sat phone and pretty much, hard drives, all that sort of stuff. Anything that absolutely can't get touched by salt water went inside of there.
So the question I had when I read the book is the question that kind of leads to the next point that I've been curious about. How did you deal with mold, and how did you keep condensation out of that box?
Well, as far as keeping it out of the box, it pretty much, I usually keep like a small Ziploc bag, half filled with rice.
Okay.
And I just keep that in there, and it sort of acts as a little, I don't know, like a sponge basically for any moisture. Yeah. And I know I'd only learned that by drowning a couple of cell phones back in my day. But as far as dealing with mold, there wasn't anything I could do about it in the Southern Ocean, because I didn't have a heater on the boat. The amount of condensation just from my own breathing and from a West Sail 32 is uninsulated, or at least mine is.
Yeah. So
once you're in that cold water, everything's just got condensation on it. And after a couple of months, the little black dots started developing everywhere. And then it just kept growing and growing. And basically it was on everything. It was on my charts. It was on the walls. It was on my clothes. I didn't realize it, but it was like on one layer and only one. I had 6 layers of thermals on, and only one layer was pretty well covered with mold. That again, I didn't know about until I was out of the Southern Ocean. But I only had one little bottle of cleaner, and I knew that it would be a waste until I got into warmer temperatures. So I just sort of lived with it. And I didn't know that you could get sick from it or anything like that. I mean, I was a little concerned when I saw how much mold was on my pillow, because I'm putting my face on that. So I would take t-shirts and I would put a t-shirt over the pillow. And then if that started to grow mold, then I would switch it up. But I guess that was about the only thing. I mean, for me, it was just the little forest that was sailing around the world with me,
Yeah, I guess so.
My little eco.
that must have been a hell of a job to clean that up when you got in, right?
Oh, it was super gross. It took forever. I mean, I put a dent in it once I reached the trade winds in the South Atlantic and started heading north. But it wasn't until I got back on land and was able to pull everything out of the boat and really get in there with a lot of usually at first I was trying to use bleach, but I found that vinegar and water worked better than anything. And it was way easier on my hands and everything. And it's still, I'm not going to say I have Mighty Sparrow 100% mold free, because I think some of it's so far underneath these floorboards that it'll probably always be on there. But, it's a reminder of that great voyage. That's how I like to look at it.
Indeed. So would you ever do it again?
Yeah, I would. I wouldn't do the exact same thing again. Before I left on that trip, my thoughts on the idea of sailing around the world alone and without stopping was that, it was the craziest sailing adventure that you could do. It was as far as you could sail without, just retracing your own track. And you had to go through all these big challenges to be able to do it from going up north. You've got to go through the North Atlantic. You got to go across the doldrums, Southern Ocean, all that stuff. And it just seemed like the ultimate challenge to take on. And now when I look back on it, after doing it, I'm glad that I did it, but I also realize that it is a roll of the dice in a lot of ways. I was very lucky that I didn't have to go through storms that were so overwhelming that there's just no way I would have made it through. And that's something that's so prevalent in the Southern Ocean. And a lot of boats have had to deal with it, and a lot of boats have been lost. And a lot of lives have been lost down there. I mean, it's a real deal. Doesn't care if I'm down there or the nicest person in the world. It's the Southern Ocean. And anybody that goes down there on any type of vessel, is always risking it a little bit, because that place can just overwhelm anything. And that's the one thing that I didn't really understand, I guess. And now I do understand it. So it's one of those things where when I think about it now, doing either a trip like it or in any event going down to the Southern Ocean, I know that it is a risk. And I know that no matter how prepared I am or how strong the boat is, it can become a place that I just can't manage, and nobody can. So knowing that, it's a little more difficult for me to just hop out and say, yeah, I'm going to go around again. But at the same time, the longer I stay on land, the more I want to get back out to sea. I think it's the same. My mom describes it as, when she was pregnant with my older brother, it only took a little while of forgetting all the pain of labor to be like, oh, I want to have another kid. And it's sort of the same thing that I'm going through. Is the longer I'm on land, the more I think about, oh, it wasn't so bad down there. Luckily, I have enough of a record and enough videos of what it was really like down there. And some of the videos are of just me so upset and so disgruntled about my position and just talking to the camera. And I can see how upset I am. And I can remember exactly where I was and how bad it was. And I don't know. I'm a lot wiser person now, but to answer your question, I know I went off on a tangent, but I would do another big trip, but I wouldn't do the exact same trip again.
Yeah, you had said in the book that as you were leaving the Indian Ocean, I reviewed some of it last night, that you didn't want to go back there again.
No.
So two things, two separate things. One, you mentioned the videos, and by the way, the videos are great. There's a West Sail group on Facebook, and everyone there seems to love you. And
we're a tight knit family.
It is.
Those West Sailors, we have to stick together.
Jerome,
you'll find out if you end up getting one.
They're fanatics. And so one of the thoughts that occurred to me is taking this video material that you have and producing a documentary. There was a German girl who adopted an aluminum yacht somewhere down in South America. Anyway, she rehabilitated the boat. She never went sailing, mind you, but she was, a pretty good looking girl. And she documented, the adoption of this boat, the rehabilitation of the boat. And then she sold the video for like $10 for pay-per-view online. So I would say that you're maybe sitting on a gold mine, because there are a lot of sailors, there are a lot of guys like me who are never going to do a trip like that would probably enjoy. I'd pay $10 to watch your documentary. I'll just put it that way.
Well, I definitely appreciate it, and the thought has definitely crossed my mind. I've heard that from quite a few people, and my trouble is I'm just not that great at editing that stuff together, and I don't know. I mean, if I was approached by the right person looking to just maybe do their first documentary or just give it a shot, I would gladly sort of hand over the stuff and do whatever it takes. But it's something where I don't think I would be able to do that on my own.
Yeah.
And right now I'm working on another book about the Appalachian Trail trip that I did in 2012. So that one's going to take for a little while. But like I said, if someone were to sort of come along and say, hey, let's turn this into something, then I would gladly do it for sure.
Okay, cool.
When it comes to these kind of things, I was reading recently about Richard Halliburton, and he was lost at sea. He was an adventurer, and he was lost at sea trying to sail a Chinese junk from China to California. And here's a guy who's super seasoned at all of these things, and it just, the storm gets the better of him. I understand storms, but what else is out there? I mean, water, okay, great. You can always bring more water. You can always provision, but like there's food. What are we not accounting for that you thought is like, this is like hard to do? And I should have brought more of this, or I brought too much of that, whatever it was.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think bar none for me personally, the scariest time out at sea is when you have lightning bolts that are just lighting up the sky and hitting the ocean within a mile around you. That to me is just terrifying. And it's sort of this instant fear until that little storm has passed. And it's rare. I've only been stuck in that situation a handful of times in all my sea miles, but that one's always pretty scary. And I guess that goes along with the storms. But one of the most frustrating and probably mentally taxing times on my big trips is when you don't have any wind and you're becalmed, because I don't rely on an engine to move forward. It's all just sails. And so I think when I went through my logbooks after the trip, I had spent 39 days where I had sailed less than, I think, 30 miles during that day. So
Wow.
Basically I'm not moving for all intents and purposes. And to sit on an ocean, especially when there's still waves. So the boat, I'm still getting rolled back and forth all day long, but I'm not moving at all. And you're basically powerless at that point. Mentally, as a challenge, that's just terribly frustrating. And the only thing I could ever do with that was to try and throw myself into projects or do anything to take my mind off of it. But the whole time it's just sitting there in the back of your head saying, you're not going anywhere. You're not in control here at all. And Mother Nature has the keys to the engine and the wind. And basically you just have to sit there, and those can happen, and they can last for days and days. And to be able to just sit there and not be productive, not make any miles, and still being tossed around by the sea is so frustrating. I mean, it was probably the worst times I had on the trip, because at least when you go through a storm, it gives you something to do. It typically goes by faster because, you know, there's a lot of action. But when there's no motion at all, boy, it's rough. So the calms are pretty bad. And, you know, on this last trip, when I was headed up towards the Northwest Passage, I had to cut through an area in the Atlantic called Iceberg Alley. And it's basically the current sort of rips all the icebergs off of the Labrador coast and pulls them out into the Atlantic. And basically one of these was what sunk the Titanic. And so it's that area of the ocean just south of Greenland. And as I'm heading up there, the thing that I didn't realize was that I was going to be shrouded in fog pretty much the whole time as well.
Wow.
So, you know, normally when you're going through an area where there's either other traffic or the threat of big containers sitting in the water, a lot of garbage, or in my case, icebergs, you know, you think, okay, well, I'll just be on watch a lot more. I'll keep an eye out. But then all of a sudden you can't see more than 100 feet in front of the boat, day or night. And you're living in this constant fear that at any moment you could just plow into this big solid object and you're going to sink basically within seconds. And that one's really hard, especially when you're trying to also at least get down and go to sleep for a couple of hours. It's almost impossible. And luckily it's only a short band that I had to deal with at that point on that trip. But there's been other instances where you cross shipping channels and all of a sudden, you know, there's 3 or 4 targets, container ships out on the horizon. And if you let your mind start wandering into what could be sitting there floating in the ocean that you might just barrel right into, it's hard to deal with mentally. And it's something where you have to control your fears and control your emotions to a point where you can put it out of your head, so that you can actually get down and sleep for a little while so that you can, you know, continue on your voyage. So those are definitely sort of scary. But I'll tell you one last one on this is when you're becalmed, and I guess this piles a lot of it together, but when you're becalmed on the ocean at night and you're in certain areas where there's a lot of sea life, when you get whales and dolphins and things like that are surfacing nearby and there's no wind at all, you can hear them for miles around, and you're sitting out alone on your boat. And if you go on deck, you can hear these big things going up and just psh, psh, and breathing. And then if you go down below, you can hear the whales singing and the dolphins squeaking. And when you're alone out there, that's akin to being alone in the woods and hearing branches breaking. And you're just thinking to yourself, what could it be? Is it coming for me? So there's a lot of strange things that sort of can all come together. And again, I guess to end it, the thing I have to remember is that you have to work mentally to sort of control your fears and sort of your emotions so that you can just deal with it and put your mind at ease, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. What is the day? Okay, so how do the days divide up? Like days when you have to be on watch, you know, throughout a 24-hour period, days when you don't even get to sleep during a 24-hour period, and then in the doldrums, I'm sure that there's a lot of nap time. But how much are you busy day to day on the boat?
Well, that's going to depend mostly on the conditions of what's going on and what sort of traffic you're dealing with. So as a solo sailor, my favorite thing is to be over 100 miles offshore, away from any traffic. So as soon as I can get the boat into a good rhythm, then it's pretty much I can kick back and relax. I can go down and take a 2 or 3 hour nap. I can sit and read a book or listen to music. I would say that when you're in normal sailing conditions, you're pretty much free to kick back and relax and do whatever you want when you're offshore. As you enter areas where there's other ships, then you're constantly having to be aware of, avoiding any collisions. And that means you're checking your position. You're keeping a good lookout up on deck. You're definitely limited in how much sleep you can get at that point. And, any time that I'm on a voyage, basically for the 24 hours that I'm then going to be pulling into port, coming off of the high seas and heading into, say like Beaufort, South Carolina, then I'm going to be up for 24 hours just approaching it because there's huge shipping containers around. I navigate those, and then I have to navigate up the river and get to the marina. And so, traffic and things, those typically drive how much you can sleep. And then wind and weather and rain will sort of drive it from, if you're offshore, if all of a sudden you get a lot of rain clouds and squalls coming in, that's going to mean a lot of constant sail changes. There are certain things you can do where you can sort of stall the boat out and then be able to go down below and just sort of sleep through almost anything. But you're also not going to be making any miles. And typically when you're out there sailing, that's the big goal, is to just make miles and get from point A to point B. And so when the rain comes, the winds pick up, and then all of a sudden the rain will kill the wind off. So the sails have to go back up, and then the winds come in and they change, and you're constantly adjusting things. And there's, sometimes it seems like I can go days without having to adjust any sails. And then other times I'll have to do 15 sail changes in one day. And,
Wow.
it's typically Murphy's Law out there. You'll be exhausted thinking, boy, I really can't wait to go to sleep tonight. And just as you're about to head below, you see a crack of lightning off in the distance, and you're probably not going to get any sleep that night at all. And then other times you're fully rested and nothing is going to happen for 2 weeks. It's kind of weird like that. I don't know why that always happens, but it seems to.
So is Mighty Sparrow, do you have a radar on Mighty Sparrow?
No, I don't have a radar. What I do have is called AIS, Automatic Identification System.
Yeah.
And that's required on all commercial vessels. So fishing boats, container ships, and most modern sailboats all have it now because it's so convenient, and it's such a great way to alert you that another ship is in your vicinity. So you can set an alarm on it. So any ship that has it, if it gets within, say, 6 miles, an alarm will go off and it'll wake me up. And I would say it works 95% of the time perfectly. And there's always a little bit of error when it comes to that stuff. I've woken up and had a ship maybe a half a mile away and never an alarm went off.
Wow.
And it's just dumb luck that I woke up, but that's very rare. Normally the alarm's going off and then I can spot the ship, see that it's not going to be any trouble, and then I can head back to sleep. But yeah, radar is one of those things where it was a little bit out of my price range to be able to install a whole unit. And I wanted to keep my boat as simple as possible. So I figured AIS was probably all I was going to need for the trip.
Okay.
So a half a mile between vessels is tight space.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and if you're staring at a 1,000-foot container ship that's doing 18 knots, it feels really close. You're like, whoa, holy cow. And then, yeah, I mean, you realize that you've got a good ways, but it's amazing how a mile can seem so far away on land, but in the ocean, you can feel like it's right next to you.
And is there quite a bit of chatter between you and the other vessels that are out there? Like you guys CB radioing it and talking to one another, or no?
Sometimes that sort of, I talk about that in the book actually, because I started going out to sea. It would have been 20 years ago, and back then, not many boats had AIS, and so whenever you saw a ship, you would always radio it, and more often than not, they would pick up. You'd have a bit of a chat. Just make sure that you guys aren't going to hit each other. And then, that was it. But there were always those sort of pleasantries. And, that dates back to the great age of sailing, 200 years ago, where two ships would spot each other and they would basically stop. They'd lower sails, they'd talk, they'd do all that, and then they'd continue on their way. Nowadays, and I think it's because AIS technology is so good, I don't think they even listen to their VHF radios when they're out there. And I typically will try and radio a ship because I'm, out there by myself. It's nice to just chat. But I'd say maybe 1 out of every 20 ships that I radio actually returns the radio call.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's sort of this beautiful thing that's sort of lost to the ages at this point. But I still try. And when you do get to talk, it's always pretty fun. And almost always the question is, what in the hell are you doing out here by yourself? And then I tell them how many days at sea I've been and all that sort of stuff. And then it goes from there. But it's always fun. It's always fun to talk to those guys.
So obviously you can do this by yourself. And there are probably times when you could use a second set of hands or whatever, but you don't need it. But if there were two of you, would the boat be too crowded?
That's a good question. I think Mighty Sparrow right now would be too crowded, but only because I've been on board for so long by myself that I've made it my home. I've moved into every little nook and cranny. And so if somebody else is on there, it's sort of like, I have to give up some of my space. But I actually, on my last trip from South Carolina to Maine last spring, I took on an old buddy of mine who I hiked with on the Appalachian Trail, and he came out on the trip. It was 9 days. It was fantastic. It took a little while for me to get used to it, but by the time we reached Cape Cod and we're headed up into the Gulf of Maine, I was just on the back barking out orders. He had to go get wet, taking sails in and changing stuff. It was fantastic. And I realized that there are benefits to having a crew member on board, and it was really, really cool. But there's also something that you can't get unless you're alone out there. And I think it has something to do with the amount of distraction that there's no distraction between you and the sea and the sky and the boat. And there's this connection that develops when you're just by yourself out there that it's still a real big passion of mine to sort of get into that state. But I dream about, upgrading maybe another 10 feet or so onto a bigger boat so I could take 3 or 4 people and then do a little island hopping trip around the world. I think that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah.
We had a friend of mine, Sean Ryan, who did some of that. I guess you would call it yacht racing. When I say that, I'm not doing a good job of describing it, but these guys are trying to get into storms because there's wind there, and they're trying to get around the world as fast as they can. And when you see the video of what these guys are going through, how they have to staple themselves into their cot, it's like folded into the hull. And then if you don't secure it down, that boat, because it's supposed to be moving, it's moving in every direction. But when you watch your video, it's like Ron Howard made up the worst possible scene ever and just was blasting people with fire hoses. And they're just sitting there and they're just enduring until they get something barked at them. And they, this is like a Formula One race around the world. I can't even imagine wanting to do that, let alone paying, a lot of money to be part of the process. But that's not like that for you. I mean, yes, you have your storms and stuff to deal with, but you're not trying to go fast. You're not trying to get into these kind of high wind situations, are you?
No. I mean, they're basically rolling over me, down, especially in the Southern Ocean. It's, it's unimpeded ocean. It's the only place like that on the planet. And these storms basically circle Antarctica. And so once every week or so, I'm going to end up getting, clobbered by one of these gales. And because I'm going so slow, they just roll right over me and I experience the whole thing. The guys that are doing, the Volvo Ocean Race and the Vendée Globe, which is just finishing up now, these guys are looking to get into the leading edge of those storms and ride that wind because their boats can travel as fast, if not faster, than the actual storm system. And so, yeah, they're high octane, pedal to the metal every second that they possibly can to be able to get in and out of the Southern Ocean quickly. I mean, those guys, I think they finished this year in 80 days.
Good Lord.
I spent more than 80 days just in the Southern Ocean on my boat. And that definitely, it does lead to quite a bit more relaxing, enjoyable sailing on my part. And that's what I was really going for. The idea of trying to race around the world was never something that appealed to me. What appealed to me was just the challenge of doing it by yourself. And I guess the reason that I went with such an older boat was just the budget and, what my influences were, which were the guys that did it back in the 60s and 70s.
You did something pretty remarkable in your trip from Beaufort to Maine, 200 miles in one day.
Yeah, 214.
Good gracious.
Yeah, well, but that was definitely assisted with the Gulf Stream. So
yeah,
we were able to hook into a nice strong southerly wind, and the Gulf Stream was running at like 3 or 4 knots. And as soon as we got out there, we just headed downwind and just plowed our way north. And I think before that, my record was around like 180. And yeah, we just blew it away. It was amazing to watch how fast we were just making mile after mile. And, to compare to some of the high-tech fast boats, those guys will do 500-600 miles in a day. I couldn't even imagine what that must feel like.
Wow.
To be able to watch the latitudes and longitudes just fall behind in your wake. Must be amazing.
Yeah, it must be.
What's next for you? I mean, okay, you're writing the book and everything about the Appalachian Trail, but your adventure itch is not going to get any less once you finish that book. So what are you eyeballing?
So my last trip basically got skunked. What was supposed to be, one of the big epic trips of all time, ended up turning into, just me being out at sea for 88 days. So I'm not 100% sure. I know that I would definitely like to do at least one more long distance trail, either the Continental Divide Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail. But again, that doesn't have to be done anytime soon. There's definitely room for one more big sail that I'd like to do, and it's sort of a stranger trip, and I'm not sure how I want to approach it. But long story short, a very, very distant relative of mine back around 1830, 1840 was sort of marooned with another guy on an island called Howland Island, near the equator, deep in the Pacific Ocean. And they were left there to protect it, for the ship to be able to return to England and then come back to mine all the guano off of it, all the bird shit. And sorry, I don't know if I could say that. But so these guys were on this island for 9 months, and it was like my great grandfather Albert, and I've always wanted to see the place, and I thought it would be pretty cool to sort of try and reenact that voyage where you'd leave from the Atlantic, go around Cape Horn backwards up into the Pacific, at least go and spot the island, if not sneak on it, because I don't think you're allowed to go there, and then return back, go around Cape Horn again, and then make it back. And that would be a trip in the 25 to 30,000 mile range. So it would be equivalent to going around the world, but it would have a little bit of personal sort of history for my family. And then it would also be sort of a unique adventure as far as doubling the horn and stuff like that. So, like I said, doing another lap around the planet, it just, I wouldn't see the point in it, I guess, at this point, but I don't know. You never know. It is still one of those things where if you want to go for the big trip, you got to go all the way around. So
Jerome, the trip that got canceled in 20, were you going to circumnavigate the North and South American continent? Was that the plan?
Yeah, it had basically two plans. If I could and I got down to Cape Horn fast enough, what I was going to do is leave from Maine, go up through the Northwest Passage, down the Pacific, and then go around Antarctica and then come up the Atlantic.
Wow.
But again, that depended on whether or not I could make it to Cape Horn by, I think my cutoff date was like December. And if I couldn't do that, then yeah, I was just going to go around the North and South America. And I think it's only been done once or twice. The first person is Matt Rutherford, and absolutely amazing feat. He did it
26-foot boat.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, unbelievable. I don't even know how he was able to do that. It takes some serious talent, and it was one of those things where I was a year late. Had I gone the year before, it wouldn't have been a problem. But they closed it down after, I think I was at sea for 20 days when they reassessed all the voyages and basically emailed me and said, we're closed. So you got to turn around. And by then I was up in the Labrador Sea, and I was basically stuck at that point because the hurricanes were already running up the coast and building in the Gulf. So I had nowhere else to go but east over towards the Azores and then down towards the equator.
Okay.
Who is they when they shut you down? What does that mean?
Oh, it just the Canadian government. They basically, yeah, well, hey, I can't blame them. It was definitely a risk going during the height of this pandemic. But I figured, that has always been sort of a nobody's really claimed the Northwest Passage as their own. And I know the U.S. don't really respect the fact that Canada claims it because the U.S. Coast Guard goes up there and stuff. Yeah. I don't know. It's kind of this debated place, but unfortunately what it seems like now is it's no longer a debate. The Canadians have basically taken over the Northwest Passage and will so for the rest of the future. So it may be one of those things where I think I might have missed my chance by 1 year, but at least I gave it a shot. I was happy for 21 days of my life. I was headed to the Northwest Passage. So most people can't even say that, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's true. And then what does something like that cost? I mean, when you budget that out, is it $40,000? I have no idea.
To do that trip. So I was planning on being out at sea for up to 400 days. And to be able to do that, plus some of the equipment that I needed and all the fuel and things like that, I think on that trip I probably spent around $15,000 to $20,000. But I already had the boat. The boat was in really good shape, so I didn't need to do an extensive refit or anything like that. So that definitely helped out a lot. For the first voyage to actually buy the boat and train on the boat and fix the boat, refit it, do all that sort of stuff. That whole trip ended up being just under $100,000. So it'll be a long time before I recoup that by any means, but other than pleasant memories and stories that I can tell. But again, that's what it's all about in the end anyway. I mean, I was never looking at it as a way to earn money, and I was actually pretty shocked that once I got back, I was able to go around and do as much speaking as people wanted me to do. And that was fantastic. So I'm hoping that things sort of calm down in the world a little bit and I can get back out there and get back on stage sometime within the next year or so, but we'll see.
That's awesome, man. I appreciate you coming on the show. I'm going to let Scott wrap up whatever question he has for you before we wrap this thing up.
Well, really, the only thing I would say, Jerome, is you ended most of your videos saying "see you out there on the sea," and so I appreciate your book. I appreciate the courage and the spirit that you bring to this, and just stay safe out there and have fun. Because if you're not having fun, you're not doing it right. And if you're ever in Beaufort, South Carolina, you have a nice cold beer waiting on you. So.
Well, I was going to say, when you first said that in the beginning, I have Mighty Sparrow in Beaufort, South Carolina.
Is it there now?
Yep.
Really?
Where
is it?
I'll email it to you. I don't want to
Okay.
throw that out on the airwaves. You know,
Okay.
you never know who might pop their head in the porthole.
All right. That is so cool. All right. Well, thank you, Jerome. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. And I really appreciate you guys having me on. And yeah, like I always say, I'll see you out there on the water.
Exactly.
Stand by, everybody.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for watching the Break It Down Show.